Hello, welcome to English Buddhist Terminology. After we have talked about the ways to become a Buddhist, as well as the very basic principles which we as Buddhists need to follow, let's now go into the actual teachings that the Buddha talked about as a part of the Buddhist religion. And to begin in this series of the major concepts in Buddhism, we need to look at the very core ideas of what the Buddha had taught. In other words, what we're going to discuss today is the most important or the central teachings which the Buddha had ever talked about, and they are the Four Noble Truths. Basically, when the Buddha spoke of the Four Noble Truths, after that, whatever he talked about always embodied the very truth that he had presented in these Four Noble Truths. So today let's look at their importance as well as their contents. The Four Noble Truths were basically the very first teachings ever spoken by the Buddha after he attained enlightenment. And when the Buddha attained enlightenment, what he realized was the truth of dependent origination. Nevertheless, even though he realized that everything arises because of dependent origination, and everything ceases to exist because of dependent origination, perhaps this was an idea that may be too hard for sentient beings to accept and understand. Therefore, he regarded his thoughts and decided that the first thing that he will teach would be the Four Noble Truths. Basically, the Four Noble Truths is regarded as the first turning of the Dharma wheel. And in his mind, he realized that perhaps by teaching these Four Noble Truths, it will be easier for sentient beings to understand why there is rebirth. So before we go on, let's first look at the actual name or the actual terminology, the Four Noble Truths. It consists of the word noble. And what does noble mean? Noble basically means righteousness, as well as those who are not ignorant. Therefore, those who are free from ignorance are considered noble and can understand the truth that the Buddha had become awakened to. And secondly, the terminology consists also of the word truth. Truth basically means that nothing is false or misleading. And before we've talked about how we're discussing the very principles of Buddhism, they actually consist of the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, and the three Dharma seals. After we have studied all these terms, you may have realized that dependent origination is somewhat similar or almost the same as what the Four Noble Truths are talking about. The only difference is that perhaps the Four Noble Truths are easier to grasp, and it actually turns the focus of dependent origination directly onto life. So these are the things we can pretty much really actually experience and see for ourselves, and therefore we'll come to understand what it's talking about much more easily. In other words, the Four Noble Truths are relevant to human lives. They are more relevant to human lives through dependent origination as it first appears. Okay, so what do the Four Noble Truths consist? They consist of the following. First of all, there is the truth of suffering, which is the first Noble Truth. And the second Noble Truth is the truth of the cause of suffering. And the third is the truth of the end of suffering. And the final one is the truth of the way that leads to the end of suffering. So in the Four Noble Truths, we'll see the truth of suffering, cause of suffering, end of suffering, as well as way that leads to the end of suffering. And now in order for us to understand these Four Noble Truths, we need to depend very much on our wisdom to realize what the Four Noble Truths are trying to tell us. For one thing, they're trying to tell us that life is full of suffering, which is the very beginning of the Buddha's teachings. And secondly, the Buddha tells us that he told us that suffering is caused by our attachment to delusion. Therefore, there's the cause. And thirdly, there is the end of suffering, which can be regarded as what we call enlightenment or complete liberation from all suffering. So after the Buddha pointed out that life is full of suffering and that what actually causes it, he tells us that it is possible for us to put an end to such a suffering. And then finally, with the fourth noble truth, the Buddha then taught us ways that guide us to the end of suffering. Okay, if we were to look at these Four Noble Truths in pairs, we can actually discover the relationship between each of these Four Noble Truths. For example, if we put the first and second together as a pair, we will see that suffering and cause of suffering make up a pair of cause and effect, where you see suffering becomes the effect, while the cause of suffering is the actual cause. And then we put the next two sets of noble truths together. Once again, we will see that it's end of suffering versus path to the end of suffering. Once again, end of suffering is the effect. And path leading to the end of suffering is the cause. So you will see that in both pairs, the effect is placed before the actual cause. So you may wonder, why have we placed the Four Noble Truths in such an order? Think about it. Why do we direct people's focus to the effect before the cause? Because it is actually much easier for people to see and understand the effect and then turn their focus onto the cause. And so, in other words, once effect is understood, we would naturally want to figure out the cause and liberate ourselves from it. For example, when you get sick, the first thing which you realize is your sickness. That's the effect. So that's where you discover that something is wrong with your body. You first discover the result of the sickness. Then the next thing you want to do is to go see a doctor, where the doctor will figure out the cause of your illness. For example, you caught the flu. Why? Perhaps because you went to a public place where there were a lot of people who had the flu and the virus was passed around. Or that you did not put on enough clothes, so you caught a cold. So that would be the cause to your illness. Therefore, the Buddha helped us tackle the problems in our lives in the same manner. What he did with the Four Noble Truths was that he first began by describing the problem. And then he talks about the cause of that problem. And after that, he talks to you about the fact that there is a solution to this problem. And then finally, he then teaches you ways on how to solve or achieve this solution. Therefore, from the way the Buddha helped us understand the truth of life, we can see how much compassion he has put into his teachings and his efforts to make his explanations easily understood. Okay, after a basic introduction of what the Noble Truths consist of, let's now take some time and look into each of these Noble Truths. And let us begin by the first one, which is the Noble Truth of suffering. When the Buddha became enlightened, what he saw was the fact that it is actually not possible for a human being to be satisfied with everything in this world. And the result of not being satisfied with this world is suffering. Okay, let's take a look at the word suffering now. And a Sanskrit term for suffering is what we call dukkha. And to roughly translate dukkha into English, we come up with the following words. First, there is the word unsatisfactory, or impermanence, even emptiness, as well as insubstantiality. So loose translations of the word dukkha comes to these words. But if you have studied other English books, you might realize that the word dukkha is most commonly translated into the word suffering or pain. And in order for us to understand what suffering is, let's look at the 3 ways for us to describe what suffering is about. First of all, we can look at suffering as what we call the 2 sufferings. And this consists of the most basic classification of suffering. Therefore, within the 2 sufferings, there is internal suffering, which means suffering we believe is a part of ourselves, such as our physical or emotional suffering. For example, when you experience physical pain, or when you experience anxiety, fear, or anger, and so on. These will become what we call emotional or physical suffering. And then second of the 2 sufferings, what we call external suffering. This means sufferings which come from the outside. In other words, an external suffering is something that is caused by changes in the environment. For example, when the weather is too cold, too hot, when there is a drought, or when there are natural accidents, or even a war, or criminals around you who cause suffering in you, then this becomes what we call external suffering. So by looking at suffering, they come from both within ourselves and from around our physical surroundings. These are the 2 sufferings. And the next way for us to describe suffering is what we call the 3 sufferings. And the 3 sufferings focus more on the quality of suffering rather than its origin or type. So instead of just talking about where it comes from or what kind of suffering it is, we turn our attention onto their actual quality. And now the first of the 3 sufferings is what we call inherent suffering. In other words, it's a type of physical suffering. It's the suffering caused by just being alive. For example, when you get sick, or when the weather is too windy, or when it rains too heavily, or when wild animals attack you. So just by being alive in this world, and your interactions with this world could cause you inherent suffering. Okay, now the second of the 3 sufferings is what we call latent suffering. This is suffering that is hidden inside even the happiest times. For example, you may get along with your friends or your family perfectly well, but you can never avoid the fact that they're going to die one day. And so people eventually will die, and this will cause you suffering. Or that you own the things that you have longed for. For example, you have, say, a beautiful cup that you have always wanted. But one day this cup could break. Or when you spend good times with your friends, good times eventually will come to an end. Therefore, when people die, or when your possessions break, or when good times come to an end, you will be experiencing latent suffering. Now, the final of the 3 sufferings is what we call active suffering. And this is suffering caused by being in a world of constantly changing delusion. For example, nothing ever lasts, or time always flies. All of this will cause you suffering because you can never hold on to the things that gives you happiness, especially physical things or the people around you. Or sometimes when you experience anxiety or fear and helplessness that has come from how things continue to change every day, this is also what we call suffering. Okay, now we've looked at the 2 types of suffering and the 3 sufferings. Let's now look at the 8 sufferings, which provide a more detailed description of the suffering that all sentient beings must endure. First of all, there is the suffering of birth. When you are being born, or before you are born, as a baby, you need to spend a few dangerous months in the mother's womb. And during this period, anything could happen to cause a miscarriage. And then you'd also experience the pain and fear of birth as you're born, because anything can happen. In other words, we are like prisoners in our bodies into the world into which we are born. Just by being born into this world, we are born into a world that is full of suffering. So, in other words, birth can cause suffering.